In 1202, a 16-year-old boy died in a castle dungeon, and the woman who ordered his death may have been his own grandmother. Most historians will tell you Arthur of Brittany was starved to death by his uncle King John of England. It's the official story, written down in chronicles, taught in classrooms, accepted without question. I've read the court records myself, and they all point the same direction. John locked the boy away, let him rot, and the kingdom never spoke of it again. But there's a wrinkle in that narrative that nobody talks about. A detail so small it almost vanished from history. Arthur wasn't just any prisoner. He was the son of Geoffrey of Anjou, King John's older brother. That made Arthur the legitimate heir to the English throne, a direct threat to John's claim. By 1202, Arthur was already in rebellion, leading forces against his uncle in Normandy. John's position was crumbling. Then Arthur was captured at Mirbeau, thrown into Rouen Castle, and within months he was dead. The whispers started immediately. Some said John murdered him in a drunken rage. Others claimed starvation. But one contemporary account, the one that never made it into mainstream history, suggests something far darker. A letter, recorded by the monk Roger of Wendover, claims that Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's mother, ordered her grandson's death while Arthur was still a prisoner. Eleanor was 80 years old in 1202. She'd already lived through 2 marriages, 5 sons, and enough political warfare to fill 10 lifetimes. She was the most powerful woman in medieval Europe, and she was terrified, not of Arthur, of losing everything she'd built. Here's what the mainstream narrative gets right. John was weak. He was paranoid, impulsive, and surrounded by enemies. Normandy was falling to the French King Philip Augustus. England's barons were restless, and Arthur, young, ambitious, and backed by the French crown, represented an existential threat to the Angevin dynasty. The accepted story stops there. It blames John, closes the book, and moves on. But Eleanor wasn't passive. She never was. By 1202, she'd already played kingmaker for 3 of her sons. She'd orchestrated rebellions, orchestrated peace, and orchestrated the succession itself. When Arthur was captured, Eleanor was at Poitiers, her stronghold, her base of power. And that's where the official record becomes suspiciously quiet. The contemporary chronicles mention Eleanor's correspondence with John around the time of Arthur's capture. Letters were sent. Messages traveled between Poitiers and Rouen. But the content? Lost, destroyed, conveniently absent from the historical record. I've seen this pattern before in courtly records. When something needed to disappear, it did. Now here's where the narrative cracks. The monk Roger of Wendover wrote that Eleanor caused Arthur's death. Not John alone. Eleanor. He was writing within decades of the event, when people who lived through it were still alive. He had sources, and he knew what he was saying would be controversial enough that later chroniclers began softening the language, then erasing it entirely. Why would Eleanor want Arthur dead? Because a living Arthur was a permanent hostage held over John's head. As long as Arthur lived, the French king could dangle him as an alternative heir, threatening rebellion, threatening invasion. A dead Arthur, especially one whose death could be blamed on John's weakness, solved that problem. It also unified the kingdom against a common enemy, the boy's death. Eleanor had done this before. When her son Richard was king, she orchestrated the imprisonment of her own daughter to prevent a dangerous marriage alliance. She wasn't sentimental. She was a strategist, and in 1202, strategy demanded that Arthur of Brittany disappear. The physical evidence supports this reading. Arthur's body was never properly buried. No funeral, no ceremony. When John's enemies later demanded an inquiry into the death, they found nothing, no body, no witnesses, no official record. That kind of erasure doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. What likely happened is this. Eleanor, fearing for the dynasty's survival, sent word to John or to the guards at Rouen that the boy was a liability. Whether that word was explicit or understood is lost to history. But the result was clear. Arthur died, and his death, blamed on John's cruelty, actually strengthened Eleanor's position by making John look weak and desperate. The irony is brutal. Arthur's death, orchestrated, possibly by his own grandmother, actually destroyed the Angevin dynasty. It turned John's barons against him. It handed Normandy to the French king. It fractured the empire Eleanor had spent 60 years building. The very act meant to save the dynasty accelerated its collapse. Eleanor never publicly acknowledged her role. She retired to Fontevraud Abbey 2 years later, ostensibly for piety, but more likely to escape the fallout from her own strategy. She died there in 1204, 2 years after Arthur. The boy who might have saved the dynasty, if allowed to live, instead became the symbol of its corruption. So was Eleanor of Aquitaine a murderer? The historical record won't give us a confession, but it will give us motive, opportunity, and the pattern of a woman who'd already proven she'd sacrifice anything, even family, for power. The accepted story of John the Tyrant is simpler, but it's also incomplete. And in history, the incomplete story is usually the one someone wanted us to believe. The truth about Arthur's death may never emerge from the archives, but the questions it raises about Eleanor, about power, about loyalty, about what a grandmother will do to protect her legacy, those questions are worth asking. Because in medieval courts, the most dangerous people were never the ones with swords. They were the ones with nothing left to lose. Subscribe for more untold stories from Europe's royal courts, where the real crimes were always hidden in plain sight.